Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, Sarah Connor, HAL 9000, Hannibal Lecter, Luke Skywalker. Mention any of these characters' names in passing conversation, and it's a good chance that the person you're speaking to has heard of them, even if they haven't seen the movie that features them. When horror and sci-fi are done correctly, they can penetrate the collective consciousness like no other genre, because horror and sci-fi can tap into our darkest fears and our greatest vision of ourselves, often within the same film. The heightened nature of these films often allows filmmakers to explore themes and scenarios not available to other more reality-based genres, such as drama or thrillers, although elements of other genres are often included in sci-fi and horror, which can add spice to premises already brimming with imagination and spectacle. Horror and science fiction have been with us since the beginning of Hollywood, when movies such as Metropolis and King Kong were being produced at the dawn of Tinseltown, using photographic techniques, although these days looked at as primitive, that were no less effective in generating thrills in the audiences clamoring to see them. Through every era in the history of the horror film, from the Universal monsters of the 30s and 40s to the Atomic Age films of the 50s, the Hammer films in the beginning of the Italian horror age of the 60s, the Grindhouse era of the 70s, which paved the way to the slasher boom of the 80s, all the way up to the torture porn, Asian horror, found footage, and ghost horror subgenres of the present. Horror has morphed and grown with the times. Sci-fi has grown and changed as well, and with its reliance on special visual effects, has been buoyed by advancements in technology such as motion control, green and blue screen photography, models, animatronics and special makeup effects, stop motion and go motion techniques, and finally, the computer-generated effects boom of the present day. In addition to visuals, sci-fi and horror can also deal with thematic content and ideas that would be harder to execute in a normal or real-world setting. Take, for example, the seminal sci-fi horror film Alien, about a murderous creature loosed upon an unsuspecting tug ship in space. On the surface, the film is basically 10 little Indians in space, with the crew being hunted down one by the titular monster. But, if you look deeper, there are themes of sexual violation and rape trauma, as the first form of the creature lays an egg in a man's throat, and the next version of the creature bursts from his chest, with the design being very phallic in its nature. The creature itself, in its adult form, appears to be a giant walking black penis, and is sadistic and cunning as it hunts down the crew, like some type of intergalactic rapist. Indeed, the designer of the creature, H.R. Geiger, used real human bones in the design for the alien. The derelict ship explored in the first act is also oddly shaped, almost like a female fallopian tube, and the sexual metaphors are abundant throughout the film, which may speak to its staying power as a classic genre entry. Another example, planted firmly in the horror genre, is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a harrowing film which hasn't lost its power to disturb 40-odd years later. But what's most disturbing about the film, even beyond the killing and depravity on display, is the presentation of the villains as a bizarro version of the family unit in America. They may be killers, but they also want to do everything in their power to please their grandpa and keep their family barbecue business profitable. Finally, to take on the thematic density of a film like 2001, which has been written about ad nauseum, is to tackle no less than the birth, life, and next phase of mankind itself. Heady stuff, and a film constantly voted as one of the greatest films ever made, 50 years after its initial release. In addition to the films celebrated in the sci-fi and horror genres, the actors and actresses that participate in these films often go on to have long careers and rabid fan bases, and are celebrated even after death. Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, Dracula and Frankenstein respectively, will live in infamy based on the classic characters they helped bring to life. Vincent Price went against the advice of his fellow theater colleagues and began doing horror pictures, and has remained famous long after his fellow naysayers faded into obscurity. His name was brought back into the spotlight again when he lent his voice to a song, a little-known tune titled Thriller. Arnold Schwarzenegger rocketed to fame by appearing in multiple sci-fi horror vehicles, Conan the Barbarian, The Terminator, Predator, and Total Recall, cemented him as a household name and box office draw well into his 70s. Jamie Lee Curtis will star in a new Halloween film 40 years after the debut of the original, and shares a horror film bond with her real-life mother, Janet Leigh, the film victim in the infamous shower scene in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, the granddaddy of the American slasher film. Will Smith, to his credit, studied the careers of various Hollywood actors and realized that, if he wanted to boost his fame, the path was through big spectacle science fiction, and decided to star in Independence Day, which propelled him to international stardom, and continues to go back to science fiction with films like Men in Black, I, Robot, I Am Legend, and Bright. So, now that we've established the dominant foothold of the science fiction and horror genres in the world's imagination, the next question we need to pose is, why haven't Black filmmakers embraced the storytelling, thematic, and cultural opportunities presented in the science fiction and horror film genres? To examine this, we must look at a multitude of factors, most obviously racism in Hollywood, but there are other more subtle factors at play here. Black people have tried to participate in horror and sci-fi. During the Blaxploitation era, in addition to crime dramas such as Superfly and Cotton Comes to Harlem, Black horror films were also being produced, such as Ganja and Hess, Blackula, which featured an incredible performance by William Marshall, by the way, Abby, which was a Black version of The Exorcist, and Blackenstein. Ganja and Hess and Blackula are good films, but Abby and Blackenstein are basically rip-offs of The Exorcist and Frankenstein. After the Blaxploitation era, there didn't seem to be any real opportunities for Black filmmakers to make sci-fi and horror on par with their white counterparts, and Black directors really didn't seem to be interested in exploring the genre. Was this because of the budget limitations of sci-fi, which does require bigger budgets for better world building? Perhaps, but horror can be made on much lower budgets, and the lack of a Black directing presence in the genre is disturbing. We also can't count out the religious presence in most Black households, which tends to eschew the devil and other darker aspects of the horror genre. Black families tend to be conservative in their religious beliefs, which I'm sure will be a factor in the projects a Black filmmaker will potentially develop. Our people tend to gravitate to comedy, melodrama, and crime films, based on our output in the last 20 or so years. Black actors also, until recently, have been regulated to supporting roles in horror and sci-fi, especially during the big sci-fi and horror boom of the 80s. Black characters were basically non-existent in sci-fi and horror until then, and our cannon fodder status was so prevalent that it ended up becoming a running cinematic joke. Braver white filmmakers, such as George Romero and John Carpenter, began to display their Black characters as at least equal to their white counterparts. Romero featured a Black lead in Night of the Living Dead, a revolutionary casting choice at the time, and also cast Ken Foree in Dawn of the Dead. John Carpenter featured Black characters in many of his films, Keith David in The Thing and They Live. Keith even made it to the end of The Thing along with Kurt Russell, by the way. Isaac Hayes in Escape from New York, and Austin Stoker in Assault on Precinct 13, in which the Black character is basically the lead in the film. Unfortunately, this progressive attitude wasn't shared by other white directors of the day, and Romero and Carpenter should be commended for doing what they did for Black characters in their movies. Blacks were still basically the support from the more important white characters in other films of the period, or were used as comic relief, like Richard Pryor in Superman 3. Ernie Hudson fares better in Ghostbusters, but other roles for Blacks in sci-fi and horror at the time were few and far between. Joe Morton starred in the thoughtful film The Brother from Another Planet, about a visitor from another planet who happened to appear Black. This is a great premise for a film, and should have influenced other filmmakers to enter the fray, but alas, it was not to be. There were other notable efforts, such as Tales from the Hood, and not so notable efforts, like Spike Lee cinematographer Ernest Dickerson's Bones. The Black thug gangster movie explosion was in full swing by this time, and the pull of tough guy posturing, as well as Martin Scorsese's Italian mafia imitation, proved to be too enticing for some. Interestingly, New Line Cinema and Marvel Comics would take a chance on a little-known character named Blade and cast Wesley Snipes as the brooding anti-hero. Blade would become a huge cult hit and inadvertently kicked off the modern superhero film as we know it. With the rise in modern digital filmmaking, shooting a movie is in the reach of more people than it ever has been. Feature film effects and compositing can be achieved on a home computer, and in this current age we may finally be seeing the rumblings of interest from Black filmmakers in horror and sci-fi. Jordan Peele's Get Out was a smash hit, and Black Panther, directed by Ryan Coogler, destroyed box office records on its way to $1 billion gross. It seems that audiences are hungry for Black characters and stories on film. More importantly, There are many stories and mythologies in Black culture, ancient and modern, that simply haven't been tapped. The trials and tribulations of Black life in America can and should lead to the creation of thousands of potential new characters, and the thematic complexity of our struggle is too rich to be ignored in favor of yet another inane Black comedy. Indeed, who says that our stories even need to take place in this galaxy? Black filmmakers can and must take advantage of this unprecedented opportunity to show the world what lies within our imaginations, for it could lead to characters that come from us and look like us being immortalized on film for generations. The movie business always benefits from new perspectives and new ways to empathize with what's happening on the big screen. But if Hollywood doesn't want to ride with us toward this new frontier, then we'll boldly go where no man has gone before on our own.